Brad and Lisa were halfway through their drive to Mammoth Cave National Park when the argument started. It wasn't a big one, just the kind of spat that happens after hours in a car. Lisa thought they should have taken the main highway, but Brad insisted on the back roads. "It's faster," he'd said, tapping the GPS. She rolled her eyes but let it go. That was hours ago. Now the winding Kentucky roads were pitch black, except for their headlights. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes back, and Lisa was clutching her phone, trying to find a map that worked offline. "We should have stopped for gas at that last town," she muttered. Brad sighed, gripping the wheel tighter. "We've got plenty to get there. Relax." The radio crackled with static before Brad switched it off. The silence felt heavier than the argument, so Lisa glanced out the window, hoping the view might distract her. But there wasn't much to see, just trees pressing in on both sides of the narrow road. No lights, no signs, nothing to suggest they were anywhere close to civilization. Then the deer appeared. It bolted out of the woods so fast Brad barely had time to hit the brakes. The tires squealed, and Lisa braced herself against the dash as the car skidded to a stop. The deer froze in the beam of the headlights, its body tense and its eyes wide. But it wasn't looking at the car. Its head was turned toward the trees, like it was listening for something. "Is it hurt?" Lisa asked, her voice shaky. "I don't think so," Brad said, staring at the animal. "What's it doing?" Before Lisa could answer, the deer bolted again, disappearing into the woods on the other side of the road. Brad exhaled sharply and put the car in park. "You okay?" Lisa nodded, but her eyes were still on the trees. What scared it? Brad followed her gaze. The woods were quiet, too quiet. He realized then that he couldn't hear anything. Not crickets, not frogs, nothing. "Maybe it's a coyote or something," he said, trying to sound casual. "I'll check the car real quick, make sure we didn't hit it." Lisa grabbed his arm. "Don't get out." He hesitated, then shook her off with a laugh that sounded forced. "It's fine. I'll be 2 seconds." He opened the door and stepped into the night. The air outside was cooler than he expected, with a dampness that clung to his skin. He walked around to the front of the car, squinting at the bumper in the dim light. No dents, no blood. Whatever had just happened, they'd missed the deer. He was about to head back when he heard it, a low rhythmic sound, like something large breathing. It came from the woods, just beyond the reach of the headlights. "Lisa," he called, his voice tight. "Do you hear that?" Lisa didn't answer. He turned and saw her staring out the passenger window, her face pale. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed. Brad followed her finger and felt his stomach drop. There was something standing in the trees just beyond the road. It was tall, too tall, and its outline was barely visible in the shadows. At first, Brad thought it was just another tree trunk, but then it moved, a slight shift like it was leaning toward them. "Get in the car," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible through the cracked window. "Now." Brad didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back inside and slammed the door, locking it. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," she said, her eyes glued to the thing in the woods. "But we need to go." Brad threw the car into drive, but as he started to pull forward, the headlights caught something on the road. At first, he thought it was just debris, a branch or maybe some trash. But as they got closer, he saw it was a pile of dead animals. Rabbits, birds, even a raccoon. All of them mangled, like they'd been torn apart and left there. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, slowing the car. "Don't stop," Lisa snapped. "Just go around it." He steered carefully, his hands shaking on the wheel. The car jolted as they rolled over something soft, and Lisa let out a small gasp. Brad didn't look back. Once they were past the pile, he pressed the gas. But the road felt endless. The trees on either side seemed to stretch taller and closer, like a tunnel they couldn't escape. Then the thing appeared in front of them. It was in the middle of the road, crouched low like it was waiting for them. Brad slammed the brakes and the car skidded to a stop just feet from it. The headlights didn't fully illuminate it, but what they could see was enough. Its limbs were long and thin, almost skeletal, and its head was tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, just stared at them with eyes that glinted faintly in the light. Lisa was frozen, her hand gripping Brad's arm so hard it hurt. "What do we do?" she whispered. Brad didn't answer. He was too busy trying to figure out how to get around it without hitting the ditch on either side. As he inched the car forward, the thing suddenly stood up. Its full height was impossible to gauge, but it was taller than the car by far. It took one step toward them, and Brad slammed the gas. The car shot forward, and for a moment, Brad thought they were going to hit it. But just as the front bumper reached it, the thing moved. It darted to the side, faster than anything that size should be able to move. Lisa screamed, and Brad kept driving, not daring to look back. They didn't stop until they reached a gas station 20 miles later. The attendant gave them a strange look as they stumbled inside, both pale and shaking. "Y'all okay?" he asked. Brad couldn't help himself and asked the attendant, "You ever see anything weird out here?" The man's expression changed instantly. His easy, bored demeanor stiffened, and he leaned in slightly. "Weird, huh? You mean something real big? Moves faster than it should?" Brad felt the hairs on his neck rise. "Yeah, something like that." The man's eyes darted toward the windows, as if checking for something. "You're lucky," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't stop for it, and you don't look back. Whatever you saw, it doesn't care about cars or people. But if you'd hit it," he trailed off and shook his head. "Let's just say you wouldn't have made it here." Brad swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Lisa, overhearing, turned to him with wide eyes. "Let's go," she said quickly. They didn't need to be told twice. Moments later, they were back on the road, the gas station lights shrinking in the rearview mirror. Neither of them spoke, but they were both thinking about what had just happened to them and how they were lucky enough to get away. James hadn't planned on hiking that day. He just dropped off some packages at the FedEx depot in Clifton, Virginia, and figured he'd stop at Hemlock Overlook Regional Park on the way back. The afternoon was unseasonably cool for late summer, and he thought a quick hike might clear his head. His boss had been on him all week about overtime hours, and his phone had been buzzing nonstop with texts. A walk in the woods seemed like the perfect way to tune out the noise. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty, except for a rusted-out minivan with a busted taillight. James took note of it but didn't think much about it. He'd left his wallet and phone locked in the glove compartment, something he rarely did, but today felt like a day to disconnect. He grabbed his water bottle and started down the trail. About a mile in, James reached a split in the trail. To the left, a well-worn path led toward the scenic overlook. To the right was a narrower trail that he didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't marked on the map at the trailhead, but it looked well-trodden. Curiosity got the better of him, and he took the right path. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting in odd ways, almost like they were reaching toward each other. The air felt heavier here, like it was pressing down on him. He thought about turning back, but figured he'd give it a few more minutes. That's when he saw the first sign something wasn't right. It was a backpack leaning against the base of a tree. The fabric was faded, and the straps were frayed, like it had been there a while. James hesitated, then called out, "Hello? Anybody out here?" His voice sounded thin, swallowed up by the dense trees. No response. He decided to cautiously approach the backpack, and then noticed it was covered in a fine layer of dirt and leaves. He looked inside to see if there was any identification, but all he found were a few crumpled granola bar wrappers and a half-empty water bottle. There was also a small notebook, the kind with a spiral binding. He flipped it open. The first few pages were full of scribbled notes, most of them illegible, but one phrase stood out, written over and over. "It's watching." James's stomach tightened. He closed the notebook and stepped back. The forest felt different now. Even though the scribbling seemed to be from a crazy person, he still felt uneasy. He told himself to not let it get to his head. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling he wasn't alone. He turned to head back the way he came but realized he'd lost the trail. Somehow, he'd wandered off it without noticing. He spun in a slow circle, looking for anything familiar, but the woods all looked the same. That heavy, pressing air was back, making it hard to think straight. That's when he heard it. A sound, almost like a growl but deeper. It wasn't far off, maybe 50 yards, and it didn't sound normal at all. He froze, straining to listen. The sound came again. He couldn't see anything through the thick underbrush, but he felt it. A presence, something big, watching him. James did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He tore through the woods, not caring which direction he went, as long as it was away from that sound. Branches snagged at his clothes, and roots threatened to trip him up, but adrenaline kept him moving. He glanced over his shoulder once, and that was a mistake. He didn't see much, just a shadowy form moving through the trees, keeping pace with him. It was huge, easily the size of a bear, but its movements were wrong. They were too smooth, almost deliberate. He didn't want to get a better look. Up ahead, he saw a break in the trees, a clearing. He pushed himself harder, lungs burning, and burst into the open space. There was a small creek cutting through the clearing, its water clear and fast-moving. He splashed into it, figuring the water might throw off whatever was following him. The growl came again, this time from the edge of the clearing. James spun around, and for the first time, he saw it, or part of it. It stayed just within the shadows of the trees, but he could make out a massive, hunched shape. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, and they weren't animal eyes. They were too intelligent, too focused. James didn't wait to see what it would do. He grabbed a rock from the creek bed and hurled it toward the trees. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all he had. The rock hit a tree with a dull thud, and for a moment, the shape didn't move. Then, slowly, it backed away into the shadows. He stood there, heart pounding, waiting for it to come back. But the forest was silent again. Not even the sound of the creek seemed to cut through the stillness. He didn't trust it, but he wasn't about to stay there and find out. He picked a direction and started moving, this time keeping the creek in sight. If nothing else, it would lead him out of the woods. It felt like hours before he found the main trail again. His legs were shaking, and his clothes were soaked through with sweat, but the sight of the familiar path brought a rush of relief. He jogged the rest of the way back to the parking lot, not daring to look back. When he reached his car, the minivan was gone. He half expected to find a note or a sign that someone else had been there, but the lot was empty. He climbed into his car, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. James didn't tell anyone about what happened, not at first. It sounded crazy, and he didn't have any proof, but he stopped going to Hemlock Overlook after that. And every now and then, late at night, he'd think about those eyes in the trees, and he'd wonder if it had let him go, or if it was still watching. It all started because Donna wanted to prove to herself she wasn't the scaredy cat her friends teased her about. Growing up in southern Ohio, near the edges of the sprawling Wayne National Forest, she'd heard the stories. Everyone had. Strange lights, noises at night, and shadows moving where no shadows should be. One Saturday evening in late October, her friend Mike mentioned a hiking trail he had found not far from her house. It cut deep into the woods and ended at an abandoned fire lookout. He said people stopped going there because of weird stuff. When she rolled her eyes at his warning, he laughed and said, "All right then, go check it out, alone. I dare you." So she did. The next evening, she packed a small flashlight, a water bottle, and her phone, fully charged just in case. It was late enough that the woods would be quiet, but early enough that she could make it back before dark. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She didn't want to deal with the inevitable "be careful" texts, or someone deciding to tag along to ruin her little moment of triumph. The first part of the trail was easy, a wide gravel path flanked by towering trees. The air smelled earthy and damp, and she felt a strange kind of calm. For a while, she wondered what all the fuss was about. Sure, the forest was dense, but it wasn't sinister. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the fading sunlight painted the trail in soft, golden light. Then she reached the fork. To the right, the trail continued up a gradual incline toward a clearing. To the left, it dipped sharply into the thicker woods. Her phone's GPS had already glitched once, but from memory, she knew the fire lookout was in that direction. She paused. That part of the trail looked different, narrower, darker, with underbrush pressing in on both sides. The air even seemed heavier. She took a deep breath and stepped left. About 10 minutes in, she stopped feeling calm. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out more of the light. It was getting harder to see the trail, so she pulled out her flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the dimness, but it didn't make her feel any better. She started to notice little things. The silence was the first. The birdsong had stopped, and the rustling of leaves seemed farther away. Then there was the smell. It wasn't bad exactly, just odd, like wet stone and something faintly metallic. She shook off the unease and kept walking. It was just a forest after all. That's when she saw it, or thought she did. Something moved across the trail ahead, quick and low to the ground. She froze, her flashlight aimed at the spot, but there was nothing there. Her heart started pounding. Probably a deer, she muttered under her breath, more to hear her own voice than anything else. She kept walking, faster now. Another few minutes passed, and the trail started to climb again. She could see the faint outline of the fire lookout through the trees, a jagged silhouette against the last light of the sky. Relief flooded her. She wasn't lost. She'd make it there, take a picture as proof, and head back before it got too dark. Then she heard it, a low guttural sound, almost like a growl, but too deep and wet to be an animal she could identify. It came from somewhere behind her. She whipped around, the flashlight beam darting over the trail and the trees. Nothing. But the sound came again, closer this time. Her chest tightened. She started walking fast, but trying not to run. Running would make her panic, and panic would make her clumsy. It's just in your head, she told herself. You're spooking yourself. But then the footsteps started. At least she thought they were footsteps. They didn't sound quite human, more like something heavy dragging through the underbrush, but they matched her pace. Every time she sped up, they did too. Her flashlight caught movement to her left, a flash of something pale against the shadows. She turned toward it, and that's when she saw it, just for a second. It was crouched low, halfway behind a tree, but its outline was wrong. Too tall, too thin, and its eyes, she was sure it had eyes, reflected her flashlight like an animal's but brighter, almost white. Donna didn't scream. She didn't even think about it. She just ran. The fire lookout was close, maybe 50 yards, and she sprinted for it like her life depended on it. The sound behind her grew louder, the dragging noise mixed with cracking branches, and that awful growling. She reached the lookout and bolted up the rickety wooden steps. Her legs burned, and her chest felt like it might explode, but she didn't stop until she was inside, slamming the flimsy door behind her. She pressed her back to it, breathing hard, and shone her flashlight through the slats in the walls. Nothing. For a long moment, the only sound was her heartbeat in her ears. She stayed like that, flashlight trembling in her hand, waiting for something to happen. But the woods were quiet again. After a few minutes, she started to think she might have imagined the whole thing. The light outside was almost gone, and she knew she couldn't stay up there all night. She peeked out the door. The trail looked empty, just a dark tunnel through the trees. She forced herself to move, one shaky step at a time, flashlight aimed straight ahead. The walk back felt endless. Every snap of a twig made her flinch, but nothing followed her. When she finally reached the main trail and saw the gravel path leading back to her car, she almost cried. She didn't stop until she was in the driver's seat, doors locked, engine running. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the wheel. She told Mike about it the next day, but he just laughed and said, "You probably scared yourself. The woods can mess with your head, you know." Donna nodded, but she didn't really believe him. The thing she'd seen, that flash of something pale and wrong, wasn't her imagination. She hasn't been back to that trail since. Sometimes she thinks about going, just to prove to herself she could, but then she remembers the sound it made, that deep, wet growl that still makes her skin crawl, and she decides against it.